Hi, everybody. This is Kerry from Donegal.
And Rab from Glasgow. Welcome to
The Celtic Tales
Chronicles.
Chronicles. Nailed it.
We nailed it. A podcast that examines some of the strange and wild stories that can be found along the west coast of Ireland.
This is part 2 of our main episodes detailing the wicked skull thief of Inishbofin. And if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, go and check it out now. And just a heads up for our listeners as well, some of this research took us to some very distressing places. So some of today's content might be very heavy. Trigger warnings for racism, colonialism, racial science, and sexual exploitation. Okay, so let's get into it.
All right. I think we mentioned before, as the British Empire expanded, more non-white, non-European people in the lands they inhabited came under its control. This control involved destruction of existing social systems, killings, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. All this violence, however, was viewed as acceptable by the British because racist science was used to prove that these non-white, non-European people were inferior to British Anglo-Saxons.
And one of the ways that these racial scientists said that they could distinguish between quote unquote superior and inferior people was by comparing physical attributes. As P.D. Curtin wrote in the 1960 Journal of the Historical Society of Nigeria, called Scientific Racism and the British, the key scientific fact that these people believed was that physical appearance was merely an outward mark of an inborn and permanent inferiority for all non-European peoples. End quote.
Yeah, so that brings us, we're discussing the comparison of physical attributes, then of course we have to discuss the deeply racist practice of so-called human zoos.
And you might be wondering, with good reason, what specifically is a human zoo? What does it entail, and what do they have to do with the wicked skull thieves of Inishbofin?
Yeah, well, just to explain, listeners, a lot of our research into Alfred Corp Hayden, the Wicked Skull Thief, were sparked by articles written by the Maynooth anthropologist Kieran Walsh, who was one of the people who helped find the stolen skulls.
And it was one of Kieran Walsh's articles in the Irish Independent that actually mentioned human zoos. He was contrasting the research and lectures of Alfred Court Hayden with the human zoos that were going on in Ireland at the same time. So he was nearly saying Hayden's practices were very different to the practice of human zoos.
Yeah, I guess this is one of the things we've been trying to keep in mind, that Kieran Walsh argues that far from being a racist, Hayden was actually a very progressive thinker who opposed the degradation of Indigenous people, at the hands of British colonists.
So we also thought it would be useful to actually look at the issue of how non-white people were displayed as part of white imperial propaganda at the time.
Yeah, it's kind of this idea of this is the contrast, we're getting anthropologists on one hand, human zoos on the other hand, so we thought, okay, we'll take the time out and dive into the subject. And as we did so, it became clear that Ireland and Irish people have a problematic legacy when it comes to race. Black people were exhibited here, and going further back, as we showed in the Berkeley bonus episode, there were enslaved Black people in Ireland. So these are things we need to reflect on.
And as we reflect on that, it's nearly coming across that anthropologists like Hayden were the good guys, and everybody who went to the human zoos and native villages were the bad guys, so the general population.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, and also it's quite complicated. Again, we talked previously about the idea of things not being binary, and we don't accept those binary narratives. There is complications, and so this episode is part of the Wicked Skull Thieves of Inishbofin series, even though we're not going to be talking necessarily about the Wicked Skull Thief himself, but we are looking at that thing that it's been put up as opposition, that he was good because the human zoos are bad. So, but it's very complicated. So we're going to just discuss the human zoos in this episode because there's a lot to discuss. And then in a later episode, we'll take a dive into the strange and troubling history of anthropology in Britain and Ireland. But for now, this episode, we're focusing on human zoos and the so-called native village phenomenon. Oh, are you
And
going to
this
say
is
that?
something, no, no,
So,
no. You're good. And it was actually really popular at the time to display non-white people for entertainment purposes. From the early 19th century right through to the early 20th century, it was something that wasn't seen as like abhorrent the way it would be today. It was seen as popular entertainment.
yeah, it's a very strange thing. And I think we've got to keep that in mind, that this is, how do we deal with that subject? How do we deal with those people who use entertainment or accept that? And I know, do you have any thoughts on that, Kerry? You've been thinking this a bit.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's not ancient history. Belgium was displaying black people for entertainment as late as 1958. There are people alive today who could have, conceivably attended a human
Mm,
zoo as a child, which is crazy to think about. And I guess when stuff like this is part of the popular culture, obviously there were always anti-slavery movements and people
yeah.
who knew that this was a bad thing. But when you look at the popular culture at the time, so many people weren't questioning it. They were just attending it as like a day out, as if they were, going to the fair or going to the cinema or something like that. It just seemed like a normal thing to so many people. And I'm not saying that's okay. It's just interesting to think about the fact that nobody questioned it, or the people who did question it were seen as radical. Whereas now, looking at it from 2023 perspective, we
Yeah.
can see that the practice of a human zoo is horrendous. But at
I
the
think,
time,
yeah,
it didn't come across like that to the white people who were attending it. They were just, oh, it's just something we're going to. And
I
it's, yeah.
yeah, I think it's too easy for us to say, ha, I wouldn't be doing that. You know, if I lived then, we don't know. I mean, I'm thinking
Exactly.
there's
Yeah.
still plenty of examples of, if we take away even just from the issue of race, actually, there's categories, but we think of maybe in 100 years' time, folk will be looking at, my God, did folk not realise the tech companies were creating horrific conditions and creating horrific work? Why did folk go along with that? Why did they accept it? There's a lot of things, you know, we need to put that critical
Yeah.
thought back on us as well.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
just something to think about before we take a deep dive. Saying that though, it's going to get a bit rough.
Yes, it's never justifiable. It's just worth looking at
Yeah,
the culture of the time. Like when you think about Ireland pre-marriage referendum, it
yeah,
was way more socially acceptable for people to be openly homophobic.
yeah,
And as a queer person, I viewed that firsthand. I was 18 when gay marriage became legal in Ireland, and
yeah.
growing up, it was a very different landscape to how it is now as an adult with, gay marriage being legal. It's way less acceptable to be like openly homophobic, especially in like a workplace.
Yeah.
But the culture at the time, 15 years ago, when I was a child, people didn't question it. It was just the done thing to not kick up a fuss about it. And there were always people who were saying, hey, that's not okay, but they were in the minority.
I
And I
think,
think it's very
yeah,
similar to the practice of human zoos, where the people who were saying, hey, this is terrible, were in the minority.
yeah. I think we've got to always be aware. It's so easy to slip into just a norm and also attacking the norm and not looking at ourselves. I mean, I was trying to think when I was thinking this, I mean, I haven't done this, but I was just trying to imagine these people. You get up in your work clothes and you get, no, not your work clothes, you take the work clothes off, you put your smart clothes on, you're going out for a day with your mates, and it's just weird that just how normal it is. But we take a moment and think of your own life. What's normal here that maybe shouldn't be normal? And
Yeah.
things that, like marriage equality, that is now normal, that which should always have been, but at one point it was homophobia, it was not. So there's all these things, or what was
Yeah.
normal, women not having the right to choose when to have children was very normal in Ireland as well. So there's all these things going on. Yeah.
It's just super important to critically examine Your thoughts, your opinions, you don't exist in a vacuum. We're getting very deep here, but
we're getting very deep.
Your choices don't exist in a
Yeah.
vacuum, and you're a
Yeah.
product of your environment, and it's up to you, especially for us as two white people, it's up to us to examine those biases and unlearn them, and tell other people, share that information. And it's really important to just think about why you think something is a knee-jerk reaction, or why you're like, oh, that's fine, sure, that's the done thing, but why is it the done thing? And I just think it's important, looking back at this, to recognize that people were not thinking more critically at the time about the practice of human zoos, to bring it back to what the episode's about. People were just like, oh, this is what's on at the weekend, and they didn't think of it any deeper than that. And it's just important to note.
I think
anyway,
listeners, we are talking about our own thoughts on this, and I guess you've got to excuse us a bit, because we've had to do the research and get the pictures and read the documents, and so give us a little moment to get ourselves ready before we dive in. So that's what we've been doing. So now we're going to dive in, and so here we go. One of the things that the Kieran Walsh article was referencing was the Dan Lowry's Music Hall, which is now the Olympia Theatre, and it listed the Human Zoo exhibit in 1886, and as the name suggests, that and all these places, they were created to displaying dehumanized people of colour for the entertainment of white people.
And as I've said earlier in the show, Belgium was displaying Black people for the entertainment of white people as late as the 1950s, 1958.
Yeah.
So that's, within living memory.
Yeah, that's living. We know people who are alive, who are still alive, who were born then. And I was looking at the exhibition, the photos of that 1958 Belgium exhibition, and I found some of them very troubling. The most troubling for me, there was a picture of it's a white Belgian boy, and he's stroking the cheek of a sleeping Congolese child. And I don't want to shame that child. He's innocent, doesn't know what he's doing. But you know what? When I saw the picture, it made me think of petting zoos. You bring the children to go and pet the rabbits or pet pig or whatever. This child's been brought to pet a Congolese child. I just found it quite...
That's so horrendous.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on that note, things are going to get even more disturbing, because it was not just the physical differences that were highlighted and often ridiculed, but for many of the women who were displayed in these zoos, their bodies were often sexualized as well. And Sarah Bartman was one such woman, nicknamed the Hottentot Venus. She was exhibited for her protruding buttocks, which was due to a condition called, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, steatophagia, that occurs naturally among people in parts of southern Africa. So it's just a medical condition, but it was seen as something overtly sexual, even though she couldn't control it. Similar to how, young girls who happen to have a larger chest are told, oh, you can't wear that, even though their peers who maybe haven't developed in the same way can wear something and not get, ridiculed or sexualized at all. It's completely out of your control, but it's still sexualized.
Yeah, it is. And that's what happened to her. And just a wee side note, Hottentot, that was a word the Dutch gave the community she came from because of the way they spoke. So it was a kind of mocking thing about their language.
Oh my God.
And
I didn't even know that.
So it was just there's so much about that story. But I think, suffice to say, Sarah Bartman, she was displayed around for entertainment around European cities, and those European cities included, in 1812, Limerick and Dublin. She was displayed here.
Mm-hmm. And again, it comes across like ancient history when you talk about the 1800s, but it was still happening, into the earliest 20th century. And we're just gonna, talk some more about Sarah and what else we know about her. Yeah,
I was looking at the website South African History Online, and it gives a lot more detail about Sarah. Or I think it's Sarchi is her name. If I pronounce it wrong, my apologies. I'm just going to keep calling her Sarah because I don't want to mispronounce her name. She was born in 1789, and She came from the, again, excuse me, Khoi community. I hope I pronounced that right. They were traditional cattle herders in Eastern Africa, Eastern Cape, South Africa. Her community, they came into conflict with Dutch settlers. In fact, they were massacred by Dutch settlers. Her fiance was one of those that was murdered by the Dutch. She was sold into slavery. And in 1810, she supposedly signed a contract with an English ship surgeon named William Dunlop. Whereas she came from the oral tradition and was illiterate, this supposed contract seems very dodgy.
So dodgy, absolutely. And she was basically a victim of people trafficking. And the magazine History Ireland does note that when Sarah was displayed in London, people did try and stand up for her at the time.
Yeah, there was a lot of anti-slavery campaigning in Britain and Ireland at the time, and there was real concern that Sarah was being exploited. But the so-called contract was shown to the court and was accepted as real and valid, and so she remained under the absolute control of Dunlop, and things got worse, yeah.
So eventually she was put on display in France, where she was now almost completely naked, and she had to obey instructions like a circus animal in front of audiences. She was just given instructions, had to just comply.
Yeah. She was also examined by scientists, and the South African History Online website talks about one of those scientists and how he, quote, concluded that she was a link between animals and humans. Thus, Sarah was used to help emphasise the stereotype that Africans were oversexed and a lesser race, end quote.
And sadly, this story does actually get even darker. So when Sarah died, both her brain and genitalia were removed from her body, pickled and put on display in a museum of man in Paris, where they remained on display until 1974. Just think about that. 1974. My parents were children. People, like, there are people alive who were full adults in 1974. It's not that long ago.
Do you know
and
what?
It was only...
I was listening to T-Rex in 1974 and jumping about. Oh my God, that's just
It's insane. Not that long ago.
No, that's part of my lived. Yeah, okay.
It's crazy. And it was only after Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa that Sarah was returned for burial to her homeland. And even then, it took 8 fucking years of negotiating before her remains were returned.
Okay. So that's the story of Sarah Baartman, and she, a trafficked and sexually exploited woman who was exhibited in Limerick and Dublin.
And we did say that this was going to be a difficult episode, and so it is. And we're going to get through it, give you all the information we have, and then eventually we will let Rab do his episode on the UFO invasion of Ireland in 2018, as we all know.
Yeah, I need to get there at some point, but we do need to get through this as well. So, okay, before we go on, I think we should know that in Europe, Britain, and Ireland, human zoos mainly contained African people, whereas in the USA, they also displayed South Asian people. So I know you, Kerry, you were speaking to someone who knows a bit more about that aspect of the human zoos.
Yeah, so as part of my research for these episodes, I spoke to a friend of the show and author, Sabina Murray, author of the 2021 novel, The Human Zoo.
What's the novel about?
So it's a novel that follows Christina Ting Klein, who travels from New York to Manila in the Philippines, both to escape her imminent divorce and to begin her research for a biography of Timicheg, an indigenous Filipino brought to America at the start of the 20th century as part of an exhibition on a human zoo. So Ting arrives unannounced at her aging aunt's aristocratic home and falls into upper-class Manila life, and it's a really great book tying together historical fact and fiction, and it is available online.
Yeah, quick plug. Sabina's books are available at kerrys.ie, the booksellers based in Galway. Okay, that's the plug over. Back to the story.
So Timicheg was actually a real person. He was one of a group of indigenous Filipino people who were brought to America at the start of the 20th century to be exhibited as part of a human zoo. And Sabina informed me when I was talking to her that when the USA colonized the Philippines, much of the general public was fed propaganda to believe they were civilizing, not colonizing the region.
Okay, so that sounds very similar to the belief held in the British that the Irish were not fit to govern themselves.
Definitely, there are similarities there, and I do think it's important to note that there are many nuances and differences between the colonial legacies left in places where the victims of colonization were white people and where they were people of color.
Yeah, I mean, like, there's the huge difference that needs to be pointed out up the top is Irish people were not put in zoos.
Nor were they enslaved, regardless of what the American alt-right would have you believe.
Yeah. And there's other complications when discussing Irish or Scottish relationships with the British Empire. Excuse me. Not least that while we were impacted by empire, we were also participants in the empire. And so that brings in the issue of white entitlement as well.
Which brings us neatly to the concept of human zoos in Ireland in the late 19th and early 20th century. And when you're looking at this, it's important to remember that the modern, especially the American concept of whiteness, was not always the way that it is viewed in 2023.
Yeah, that's an important thing. Like, for a long time in America, white was Anglo-Saxon, and then there was a whole deliberate process of absorbing Irish and Italian into that as well. I mean, they were excluded for a long time, and then they were absorbed. I mean, whiteness is something that's created, and blackness is something that's created, and it was created quite deliberately to allow the enslavement of people. You know, these are quite deliberate concepts. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's important to note. And I remember actually hearing on another podcast called Bingetopia, which is fantastic. It's these two girls from LA and it's great. But they were talking about the idea of white privilege. And one of them had seen a tweet that had stated that Anne Frank had white privilege. And they were talking about it and the concept of whiteness and how, okay, yes, in 2023 in a supermarket, if, you know, Anne Frank and a black person are in a supermarket, yes, she would have had white privilege. But as a Jew in Nazi Germany, she was not viewed as white and she did not have white privilege. So it's really important to have that nuance. And the episode of Bingetopia dealing with that is a really great look into it. One of the co-hosts is Jewish and she does talk about it. But yeah, the concept of whiteness as it's viewed today is not applicable always to the concept of whiteness in the past.
It's quite a malleable thing, the whole white and black thing. And we will take a deep dive at that at some point. Yeah. Just note that.
Yeah. So we don't have too much information on the late 19th century exhibitions of black people in Ireland, but there is a fair amount of information on the final Irish Human Zoo, which took place in 1907. So at this point in time, the exhibiting of non-white people took the form of a native village exhibition, which was still awful, but not as bad as the earlier exhibitions, as it was a full-on village setup and it was
Excuse me. Sorry, I've got a doorbell. Excuse me, hold on. Yeah, hold on a second. Hold on.
There's someone at Rab's door. He's probably going to edit this out, but if he doesn't, hi guys, nice to talk to you. You're definitely going to edit this out, Rab.
All right, so do you want to take it from, so we don't have much info in the late 19th century exhibitions?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. But not yet. Hold on.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, go.
So we don't have much info on the late 19th century exhibitions of black people in Ireland, but there is a fair amount of information available about the final Irish Human Zoo, which took place in 1907. Though at this point in time, the exhibition of non-white people did take the form of a native village exhibition, which was bad, but was not as awful as the earlier exhibitions.
Yeah. And I think it's important to know this is a native village exhibition, and it's taking place in Ireland. Only a few years before the events that will snowball into a decade of conflict and bloodshed in Ireland. This is what's all going on at the same time. At the same time, there's elements in the British military, political elites, and royalty who are absolutely opposed to giving Ireland any form of self-government. And in 1914, the Ulster Volunteer Force, they're going to smuggle weapons to oppose Home Rule, and they're going to be openly supported by elements of the British elite. So things are about to kick off here in Ireland. And just a few years before that, there are black Somalians being put on display in Dublin.
Yeah, it absolutely boggles your mind to think that exhibiting black people for a white audience was one of the ways of showing that everything was normal and fine in Ireland, that there was no conflict.
Yeah. This is, again, it is mind-boggling because this exhibition of Somalian men, women and children, it was part of this huge jamboree known as the Great White Fair, which was showing that things were normal here. So, Kerry, what was the Great White Fair?
Well, it was a massive exhibition of British, Irish, and international crafts, industries, culture, and entertainment. And here are some details from an article by Brian McCabe called the Irish International Exhibition of 1907. So it covered 52 acres, featuring an artificial lake offering boat rides. There was a 50-foot-high helter-skelter slide, and it also had a grand central palace which featured concerts, vaudeville acts, and other entertainment. It had a palace of fine art, housing 1,500 paintings, and there was also a palace of mechanical arts with all of the latest electronic mod cons, and a palace of industries, which did include an arts and crafts section. So it was massive.
It's massive. And you know what? It does sound kind of cool. I mean, it does sound awesome.
It sounds like the kind of thing people would want to attend, and it had over 3 million visitors running from May to November in 1907.
So that's basically the population of Ireland.
Basically, yeah.
Everybody went. Oh my God. I mean, it sounds mind-blowing. Yeah.
It absolutely
again, we're talking
does.
about this. It's the context again. If you were there, you would want to go to that kind of place.
Yeah.
It's the place to be.
And everybody went to it, including King Edward the... Excuse me, I'm going to say that again. It does indeed.
I choke up when I use any royal term as well.
Yeah.
An allergy or something. Anyway.
That's it. I have an allergy to the royals. So including King Edward the Seventh, is that right? Yeah, seventh. Queen Alexandra and their daughter, they visited all the exhibitions, including the Somali villagers clad in spotless white robes and carrying shining white spears, end quote.
Okay. This is where things start to get problematic about the exhibition. But just talking about that little moment, when I read that, my first thought was of the recent coronation of King Charles, the whatever. An attendant during the service was a guy dressed up in Scottish Highland dress. Okay. Jesus. And there's like happy exotic native helping some elitist British fuckwit with his British elitist fuckwit rituals. Excuse me.
I know.
I don't want to take away from. Okay. Let's get back to the subject. All right.
Before we start ranting on about the British, just remember that this exhibition was a massive hit for Irish people too. And of course, the most popular and profitable exhibition at the Great White Fair was the so-called Somali Village.
Amongst that 3 million folk, I know one famous Irish person who really loved this exhibition. Can you guess who?
Give me a clue.
Okay, you ready? I want to suck your blood.
Bram Stoker, Mr. Gothic vampire white worm rider himself.
Yeah. In fact, the name, the Great White Exhibition, was coined by Mr. Stoker. I think it was originally called the Irish International Exhibition, but he got the snazzy phrase, the Great White Exhibition, and he wrote an essay about it. He kind of got to visit it all before it formally opened. And so he wrote this exhibition and he praised it as a wonderful example of how Ireland was leaving behind its old conflicts, and was now embracing industry and progress. And do you know what? Can I give you some of the quotes?
Absolutely, but maybe let's leave the vampire accents behind.
Do you know what? A lot of vampires will be upset at me taking their accents.
Exactly.
So, yeah, I'm just going to give a look to the vampires. Okay. All right. So people can read the full essay in the link in the episode notes, but here's a few quotes to give it the flavour of Bram the Mam's view of the exhibition. Quote, "It is safe, therefore, to predict that when His Majesty the King visits the Dublin exhibition during the coming summer, he will find an outlook which for brilliancy and beauty has never before been equalled in these isles. There has been a great deal of controversy and recrimination in the course of its completion, but it is sincerely to be hoped that after the gates of the Great Fair are opened on May the 4th by the Lord Lieutenant in full state, all bitterness will pass away, and that there will remain full opportunity for a general expression of Irish pride in an object so worthy to evoke it. Fenianism and landlordism are rapidly passing away, if they are not even now come to an end. Patrick's problem is fast finding its solution in diverse ways. Perhaps the many visitors to Ireland whom this exhibition will attract will be astonished to find here and outside in the country at large what wonderful things have been done to start the island upon a new career of industrial progress, aside and beyond affairs political."
So he's basically saying the Irish are giving up their conflicts and starting to enjoy industrial progress. And this is what, only 6 years before the Dublin lockout of 1913.
Yeah.
I'm raging. As someone who loves vampires, to hear that Bram Stoker was so anti-Fenian, very sad.
You know what? We could go in a whole other rabbit hole, jumping down there. What is the problem with Fenianism and vampires? Why are they not connecting? I'd have thought there'd have been... Anyway, whatever. Okay. Here's an interesting thing just about this. So the guy who was involved in smashing workers' rights in 1913 was the same guy who was the driving force behind the Irish International Exhibition. This was a guy called William Martin Murphy, and he was the owner of the Irish Independent newspaper, whose name lives on in the annals of Irish infamy.
And it should come as no surprise, therefore, that his exhibition included a fake Somali village, but in actual fact, such fake villages were very common across Europe at the time. So here's a quote from another History Ireland article called Colleen's, Cottages and Corrals, The Politics of Native Village Exhibitions. Quote, "In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fake native villages, often African but also sometimes Far Eastern, were hugely popular attractions throughout Europe and America at great exhibitions or fairs. They typically took the form of village buildings complete with villagers who lived on the site, and metropolitan audiences could wander around watching the villagers go about their daily routines and producing traditional crafts. At the height of the Age of Empire, these displays provided a virtual travel experience to the farthest flung corners of the world. They always presented the people and cultures of the villages as primitive, thereby assuring imperial audiences of their own cultural superiority and, by extension, providing popular justification for the imperial projects themselves. The overwhelming majority of these villages were run as commercial ventures rather than state-organized displays." End quote.
Yeah, that's a fascinating article. And again, there's a link in the show notes. It goes on explaining that article that there was also Scottish and Irish fake villages, but they were very different. You know, they were more akin to, board vulture visits to America or Irish trade fairs to Norway. Okay, it was, people had agency, they were selling goods, they were marketing. Whereas the African native villages, they serve an entirely different purpose. They're about highlighting black people as different, as primitive, and as needing white people to help them.
Yeah, the fake Scottish and Irish villages sound nearly more like the Ulster American Folk Park, where I went to on a school tour when I was 10, and they had people dressed in the traditional clothing, but they're all paid actors.
Yeah.
It's not the same, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this article does also show just how much money white people made from these exhibits of so-called primitive people. So according to the article, quote, the single most popular and profitable sideshow exhibit was a Somali village. The exhibition's official catalogue announced that a party of Somalis has been imported from British Somaliland, which is situated in the northeast of Africa. This village has been erected to represent the huts in which the natives live in this country. A schoolroom has also been built in which Somali children will be taught their lessons. End quote. This made a profit of almost £10,000.
Yeah. I'd imagine that's a lot of money. 120
Back then, yeah.
years ago. Yeah. It's a lot of money now, but yeah, back then. There's another article I was looking at in a Dublin zine, comeheretome.com by Donald Fallon. And it was also looking at that 1907 exhibition. And this article includes a photo of an Irish Times article from May 1907, so just after it opened, which hints at some of the health issues the Somali villagers were experiencing. Quote, this is from the Irish Times, what the Irish Times was writing. We are officially informed that the rumours regarding the health of the occupants of the Somali village are quite unfounded. Dr. C. Preston Ball certifies there have been no deaths and no case of infectious diseases, and that the man with the wounded arm is now convalescent. End quotes.
I just did the maths. It's about 1.3 million in today's pounds.
Oh my God.
So that's a lot of profit off of this.
Oh my God. Oh,
I know.
these men, women, and children as well. Oh my. Oh my. Okay. All right.
And according to the comeheretome.com article, the Somalis also experienced other stressful things, and that these events would live on in popular Dublin folk memory. Apparently, Flann O'Brien once recounted that a famous Dublin trickster known as the Bird, also the fact that your occupation could be a trickster back in the day, kind of interesting. But this guy, known as the Bird, stole the baby of a wild man of Borneo from the latter's straw house or tent and smuggled it into the snug of a pub in Ballsbridge. End quote. That is insane. Literally kidnapping children for the crack.
Yeah, for the crack.
While Hugh O'Connor claimed he returned it to the French pavilion as a gesture against the decline in the French birth rate.
Yeah. So these could be apocryphal stories, but they do show incredible contempt for black families. Excuse me. Kidnapping their babies is something to laugh about.
And even if such a thing never actually happened, it does start to give a sense of just how difficult things were for these men, women, and children. Basically, families from Eastern Africa are dumped in some dodgy accommodation in Dublin to be pointed at by white locals who joke about stealing their children.
Yeah, but worse than that, they had to meet the fucking British royal family.
On that cheery note.
Yeah, I think on that cheery note, yeah. I think that's the deep dive. We've done a deep dive.
That's the deep dive.
Yeah. So
yeah, we're going to be looking more into the Skull Thief information. We're going to have another episode in the series exploring more of this. But for today's episode, I think we'll leave it there. Yeah, very intense stuff, very depressing stuff, but it is important to talk about. And if you have any, thoughts, you can email us at theceltictaleschronicles@gmail.com, reach out on social media, let us know what you think of the episode and rate and review.
So I think that, can we think of positive things? I need to go to a positive place after all that.
Yeah, do you have any good news actually to end things on a lighter note?
I do, and I can't find my notes. You're going to have to work with me for a minute. Sarah Bartman, apparently there's a provincial area in South Africa has been named after her. So that's that's a nice thing. That's good.
That's a nice thing, yeah.
Recognising that. There's actually a railway tunnel when the railway developments were going in Belgium. There was a railway tunnel named after him in 2007. So I guess there is a lot of, the positive thing is there is acknowledging these people, what their names are. I'd love to have the names of the people who were in the 1907. So I guess I'm going to throw that out to listeners. Does anybody know the names of those people? It'd be nice to know who they were. But yeah, I think the positive thing is that it was shocking. People recognise it's shocking. Places have now been named after, these fellow human beings who were displayed. And you know what, Kerry? I think we should be naming places in Ireland because those people were displayed here as well. So
you're dead right, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's everything. Any good news with you? Any good news in life? What's going on?
Any good news with me? Well, the sun is out today. The sun is splitting the rocks, so I definitely need to get outside and get some vitamin D because I think I'm lacking. I'm very pale.
You can become a vampire.
Oh, do you know what? That's my vibe anyway. That's true. I'm a very freckly vampire, but one nonetheless.
A freckly vampire
Mm-hmm.
who can go out giving out to Fenians. There you go.
Yeah, that's an interesting Halloween costume for next year.
Yeah.
What about you?
Just the sunshine's lovely, and yeah, I think just it's a lovely day. I'm going to take my pup for another walk. I've got the washing out. I found a lovely Indian vegan recipe I'm going to try tonight.
Oh, very nice.
Cooking. So yeah,
that's it.
Good. That's good news.
Yeah,
all positive.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, and I think we'll leave it there.
I think we're going to not quite leave it there because I think Kerry's going to make an announcement now about setting up a Patreon.
Oh, you're right. My terrible memory. Yes. So we are going to be setting up a Patreon. Details to follow on our social medias as well. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at the Kerry Graham, and Rab is on Twitter at Havering Rab and on Instagram at Celtic Tales Galway. We're going to set up a Patreon for bonus content, behind the scenes. A lot of the time when we're researching for episodes and stuff, we'll find extra information that doesn't make it into the main episode, but we still want to discuss it. So yeah, that'll be coming soon on Patreon.
So stay tuned. And mind, rate, review, tell your friends, tell your ancient enemies about the greatest podcast show on the planet, which is us, the Celtic Tales Chronicles. That's it. So long.
The Celtic Tales Chronicles is written, hosted and produced by Kerry Graham and Rab Fulton. Edited by Rab Fulton. Cover artwork by Kerry Graham. Music by Kevin MacLeod.